Why wouldn't we be talking about providing energy security to our friends in Ontario and Quebec and Atlantic Canada by having our own pipeline built?
Renewed calls for pipelines are echoing across Canada because of Trump.
I asked the federal government to immediately approve the Energy East project.
Canadian politicians want to protect the country's economic interests ahead of Trump's proposed tariffs, including a 10% tax on energy resources. That would seriously impact Canada's biggest export moneymaker, crude oil. The United States is Canada's biggest customer for oil by far, and most of it comes from Alberta. The landlocked province uses a vast network of pipelines to get its energy resources to refineries and ports across Canada and the US. Most of them go through or directly to the States, a country that gets more than half its oil from Canada. Canada is so reliant on the US, even if we got a 10% tariff, we'd still have no choice but to continue to sell to them, unless there were other options.
Now we have an opportunity to have a different conversation and, frankly, to strengthen our sovereignty.
She's talking pipelines. There are two previously canned plans that keep coming up again now, Energy East and Northern Gateway. The idea is to get Alberta oil directly to the east and west coasts, then sell it at home and export it around the world. The Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion, for example, does just that. Currently sending about 600,000 barrels of oil a day directly from Edmonton to West Coast ports. Some still goes to the US, but some is sold to Asian markets.
The world is our oyster.
Former Alberta Premier Rachel Notley is on the Prime Minister's Canada-US Relations Council.
Oh, they are so tired of hearing about it from me.
What is the reaction, though, honestly?
Well, there's a lot of head nods. People understand that, this is a frustrating situation that we're in. I think, some folks are wondering, is this really doable?
Is it? Northern Gateway, Energy East, and other pipeline projects were called down for a lot of reasons. Some include a lack of federal government support, pushback from Quebec and Ontario, and environmental concerns. So it's been a challenge to get everybody on board. Would that change now?
In the aftermath of what has happened, we do need to reflect a little bit. Right now, much of Ontario and Quebec get their oil from a pipeline that runs from Canada into the United States and back up to Canada.
What Mr. Trump is doing may change the situation in the future. So if there's a social acceptability, we will be open to these kind of projects.
Do you think people will be changing their minds now that we might be facing a trade war?
I think so, yes. If I look at my social media feeds and this united front against the tariffs, that gives me some hope that we can and will work together more closely on solving problems like this. There's definitely
Energy advisor Karina Bryson, with 30 years of oil industry experience, says it's all about impact.
If you start having lines at gas stations and shortages and things like that, they might decide that security of supply is more important to them than some of the reasons they were opposing those pipelines in the first place.
Some of the most visible calls against pipelines in Canada come from First Nations communities. But when Trump's recent tariff threats surfaced, at least one leader seemed to waver.
We are staring into the abyss of uncertainty, the climate crisis, and the American threat. So I would suggest that if we don't build that kind of infrastructure, Trump will.
What did you mean when you said, if we don't build this type of infrastructure, Trump will?
Everybody steps in it once in a while. And I think I kind of stepped in it there. But we've since clarified our position.
Would you support a new pipeline through British Columbia?
No, absolutely not. The reason is abundantly clear in regard to the destructive impacts of the intensifying climate crisis. Our history is written on the land itself. So we're very dependent on what happens to the land.
Potentially, the biggest hurdle is who would pay for these pipelines. The companies that were involved in those canceled pipelines tell CBC they have no interest in restarting them. Any new company would have to start the regulatory process from scratch. Now, some suggest if no private companies step in, the federal government could, like it did with the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion. But again, would it?
building on the Team Canada approach. If as a nation we decide we want to do this, we can do this. But it's going to take an awful lot of people rowing in the same direction at the same time for a sustained period. It's a long time since we've done that as Canada.